My name is Andrea Ballestero. I teach here in the anthropology department at USC. And the salon today has been focusing on the question of interference. We had, I think it was 12 students from all over California and Canada who shared their ongoing work with commentary, insights, and suggestions from our three guests, whom I will introduce in a moment. And this afternoon, the idea is to expand that conversation. I have prepared some questions, and there will be questions from the speakers or the round tablers to each other. And then hopefully we'll have time for your questions and comments as well. So before we get started, I want to first thank the Emerge Collective, which is a collaborative project that brings together ethnography labs, centers, and studios in 5 institutions in the United States and Canada, and which is led from Concordia University Ethnography Lab. I also want to thank Ari Hoyos in the Department of Anthropology here at USC, who's central to making all of this happen, and particularly our ethnography studio team, our coordinator, Katie Ulrich, and our 2 fellows, Aline Bravo and Emma Jahoda Brown, who have been amazing in making all of this happen. Yeah. So like I said, the 2025 Ethnographic Salon examines the question of interference as a condition for and an ethnographic object of research. We ask, how do we, as ethnographers, interfere within our research, via our research, despite our research, or as our research? And what do we interfere in? This workshop takes interference as a practice, condition, and/or object of ethnographic research. In visual anthropology, for instance, and in documentary filmmaking, some have insisted on non-interference in order to follow everyday life as it unfolds. The same was insisted at a certain point in time for participant observation, a view emerging from perspectives ranging from positivistic scientific claims to wariness around colonial or a neo-colonial mandate to interfere in subjects' lives. Yet anthropologists also think of interference as a modality and methodology of interrupting ideas of naturalness and common sense, both within the anthropological discipline and beyond. But beyond theorizing interference and what it might be, this workshop has aimed to explore how we as ethnographers might create the conditions for multiple forms of interference, particularly at times when the scope and impact of ethnographic research might not seem to easily upscale or scale up to the profound problems that we witness in the world. We ask not how ethnography must be changed in order to interfere effectively, but how to expand the accessibility and imagination of interference itself. So to have this conversation this afternoon, we have invited 3 amazing guests that I will proceed to introduce before opening the conversation with a question. First, we have Meghanne Barker, who is a lecturer in education, and actually Meghanne is in the middle, so I'm not going in order. Lecturer in education, practice, and society at the University College London. Her research examines the pedagogical value of creative practices, including children's play and performance, puppet theater, and filmmaking. And she follows these practices to post-socialist institutions of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Her first book, Throw Your Voice, Suspended Animations in Kazakhstani Childhood, has been published with Cornell University Press recently, so I really recommend everybody to go check it out.
Open access.
Open access, fantastic. There she examines acts of animation, the moments when humans bring non-human objects to life or compel one another into action, as a way of maintaining fragile social relations and political order. Her ongoing research, Building New Film Cities, examines the role of media education to community building in the 21st century within the context of the former Yugoslavia. Her work has been published in a variety of venues, including the Russian Review, Semiotic Review, Anthropological Quarterly, the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, amongst others. We also have Jenny Cho, Associate Professor of East Languages and Cultures and Anthropology here at USC. In her research and teaching, she explores subjectivity, collective memory, and modernity with an emphasis on understanding the shifting contours of race, ethnicity, and cultural heritage as powerful categories in the contemporary world. She investigates these issues through long-term ethnographic fieldwork on independent and vernacular media practices, on urbanization and the transformation of rural landscapes and livelihoods, and on cultural heritage tourism in the People's Republic of China. Her first book, A Landscape of Travel, The Work of Tourism in Rural Ethnic China, utilizes mobility and visuality as analytics for exploring the consequences of tourism development on social relations and individual senses of self. As part of this project, she produced a film called Peasant Family Happiness, which received the Plath Media Award given by the Society for East Asian Anthropology. And we also have Juno Salazar Parreñas, who is an associate professor of science and technology studies and feminist gender and sexuality studies at Cornell University. Her work examines human-animal relations, environmental issues, and efforts to institutionalize justice. She is the author of Decolonizing Extinction, the work of care in orangutan rehabilitation, which received the Michelle Rosaldo Prize from the Association for Feminist Anthropology, and honorable mentions from a variety of prizes, including the Harry Benda Prize from the Association of Asian Studies, the Society of Medical Anthropologists, New Millennium Book, and the Anthropology of Work and Committee for the Anthropology of Science, Technology and Computing, Diana Forsyth Prize. Her articles have also appeared in a variety of venues across anthropology and science and technology studies. She is also a former columnist for the Los Angeles-based monthly magazine, The Lesbian News. She has been in collaborations and conversations with artists, which have been hosted in venues such as MoMA, Kunstradio, and Documenta 14. And so we have a fantastic group of colleagues to have these conversations with. And as is tradition, I will start with a question to begin to warm us up towards what this conversation might be. So in preparation for this morning, our guests shared with us 3 pieces that all of the participants read, and maybe we can put the links on the Zoom chat so that people can get to them. So maybe we'll begin talking a little bit about those. And so the 3 pieces that you gave us to read for this morning's workshop offer what we might imagine as 3 different approaches to interference. In Jenny's case, the potential for interfering with a performance of ethnicity or indigeneity that is hijacked from what it's supposed to be its political objective. In Juno's case, interfering with the extractivist logics of mining corporations as a model for anthropological research, and instead privileging the position of fuzzy diggers, specifically moles. And in Meghanne's case, interrupting the naturalization of caregiving, for instance, as something that only mother-like subjects can perform. And so I was wondering if you could speak briefly about how you see interference working in each of these pieces that you shared with us as a way to start the conversation. So maybe we can begin over here.
Great, thanks. It's been such a pleasure being here and thinking with your projects, especially in the stage of cooking, early cooking. It's exciting to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about the context in which I wrote this article. It was in a AAA panel that in the Q&A, there was a question around, okay, how can you make sure that your multi-species ethnography, where your interlocutors don't speak, how do you make sure it's not an extractive process? And I was like, I don't think ethnography is inherently extractive. But at the same time, I was working with undergraduate students who got internal research funds and to do their work. But then when it came down to writing, they were too freaked out because they felt the weight of feeling like I am like doing some kind of theft here. But the point is, it's like they got research funds, and if they don't write, it just stays with them, you know, like the project ends there, where there's actually a greater responsibility to share your ideas. And the point isn't that we're collecting gems from people. What we're doing is we're gaining memories and shared experiences, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about those fleeting moments that other people have moved on, you know? So it was the realization that, one, I don't think ethnography is inherently extractive. And I felt like we're not like a mining corporation here. We're like something way more modest. We're like moles. We're like small little tiny animals whose bodies are like this big, like measured in millimeters, and they exist in these very large plains that are like measured in kilometers. And they dig, they spend their lives digging, and sometimes they dig once, you know, and sometimes they keep revisiting the same places. And I felt like, wow, this is the perfect metaphor of what ethnographers do. I'm the kind of ethnographer who, you know, goes somewhere, like spend a lot of time digging stuff up, coming back, transformed by the experience, having all sorts of things clinging on to me, and then feeling like, you know, that was enough. Now I'm gonna go to another part. Whereas some anthropologists, or some ethnographers I know, they keep going to the same place over and over and over again. And they're like thinking about different things that happen every time they go to the same place. So I really got attached to this metaphor, but what I really liked about thinking about the material life of a mole is the way that they interrupt space. And interruption is a tricky word because on one hand, or interference, sorry, interference. Interference has this language to me that reminds me of corruption, you know, where it's the allegation of you are interfering in a natural, fair process, and that you are messing it all up, you know? But what I find useful around the language of interference is its valence between interruption, which assumes that you can kind of return back to the same thing, and disruption, which just ends the process, you know? That interference gives us a moment to pause, potentially reflect. And that's what I think is helpful with thinking about this analogy of the mole as a field worker. That disruption is also part of this interference, right? That I think are all useful ways to think through just this moment where we pause to think about how things that seem to be so natural are actually not, how they come to be processed, and that adding another actor into this constellation can potentially change that process, which I think is helpful for thinking about yourself as an ethnographer. Just by the fact of being a person in the room does indeed change the dynamic. And so acknowledging that, I think, is helpful, but also knowing that the story isn't ultimately about you. You're not the one who's like shaping the story. You're not the experimental scientist who's like manipulating conditions for another life being. You're part of the story, but not like the director of the story. And that's what I think is like a really useful analogy for thinking of ourselves as very modest researchers. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. But before I talk about my work, I just want to say that my child is terrified of moles. So I kind of know that you were sort of describing us as moles, but he saw a mole in a puppet show, and it scared him, and he still talks about it all the time.
Is it like the big hands and the weird nose?
I think he got it conflated with a different puppet because he has this idea that they have big eyes, and I'm like, their eyes are actually tiny, and it is anyway.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, it's useful to like think about myself as a mole, and maybe I can convince him friendly things because he does like me. Yeah, so the chapter that I shared with you all was about, you know, sort of working through this question of who is a mother, and when children are living in temporary care, how do the different women, because it was only women that they were around, come to stand in or try not to stand in for for the mother. So to what extent is taking on that that role seen as potentially interfering with the relationship that they're going to go back to. And my position as a researcher who I never wanted to have, I didn't want the kids to see me as an authority figure, because that meant that when the other adults were out of the room, the kids would do things that they wouldn't do when the other adults were around, which I found to be really productive. The reason I shared this chapter in particular is because when I was first working through this material after my fieldwork, I gave a talk and I showed a lot of videos and talked through just without a lot of analysis yet, because it was still pretty fresh from the field, but I showed a lot of videos or stills from my work, and it was a group that was bringing together anthropologists and psychologists, and it was a psychologist actually who was there to comment on my work, and whoever invited us thought this would be a really productive conversation. But that psychologist actually, and I don't want this to be a sort of way of saying that psychology is bad, but that psychologist taught during her commentary and then afterwards, and then she also emailed me, found it really problematic that I was sitting on the floor playing with the kids while I was recording that, because her, I think in her mind, which was sort of ironic, considering the ways that a lot of times psychologists will do very sort of strict controlled experiments where they're intervening in very measured ways, right? But that's seen as being, there's something very rigorous about that. Whereas what she thought that I was supposed to be doing was sort of observing their natural play, and by being in the room with them and interacting with them, even if it was letting them play with me or seeing how they fixed my hair or whatever, that I was interfering just sort of with my body. So that was really sort of striking to think about afterwards, about ways in which participant observation creates these sort of fuzzy conditions of interfering in a sort of undisciplined way, a sort of spontaneous way where we don't necessarily plan what it is we're going to do, and yet somehow we're using those interactions and those relationships as information in sort of a way that's sort of less easy to sort of justify how knowledge is produced in this messy way. And then when I was going back to sort of look at the chapter, I couldn't remember if I had actually written about that fact, and I think that I didn't. And sort of going back to the fact that there's a way in which the process of thinking about your own interference is part of the process, but doesn't need to be sort of the overwhelming story, going back to what Juno was saying about how it's not about you. So I think there's also this way of thinking through our ways of interfering without letting that be the whole story, so that we can still give that space to the people that we spent time with. Yeah, so I'll stop with that.
Hi, everyone. So the piece that I shared with the participants this morning is an open access piece you can find on the internet. And it's called On the Spectacle of Being Our Meow Selves. And just as a quick summary, it's a short essay about what it feels like to be asked to be looked at. Some of my work is taking place in a village that's heavily touristed in the Miao region of Southwest China, where one of the ways in which people there make money is that tourists come and will pay village residents, usually women, to wear their festival clothes and then take pictures of them. And so I'm sort of studying the tourism industry. Of course, I was interested in the performativity, the showiness of it, but then in this piece, I wanted to really focus on sort of the question of but what does that feel like to know that someone is, that you are an object of desire, a visual desire, right? But it's an economic choice too. And, the village women can say no, they don't usually, most of the time, because it's part of their business. And so in the article, I include 3 short videos of conversations, 2 of which are conversations I had with 2 of my main sort of friends, interlocutors in the village, where they're telling me stories about times when they got dressed up or someone they knew got dressed up and then were being looked at, and how it felt in one case, or how they sort of realized that the purpose of them getting dressed up was not what they thought it was. It was to sell a product, a food product, but they thought they were promoting their village. So that's the main structure. And so interference comes into this in, I think, two ways. One is empirically in the stories that these women tell me about how they interpret their own bodily sort of performance and their own bodily choices, or sartorial choices, a better way of putting it. And how in one case, when a group of women who was hired to wear Meow Festival clothes, they were paid to travel to a convention, and they realized they were there to promote this sort of company's food product, not their village. They said that they didn't want to do it anymore. But then the main woman in the village, who sort of runs a lot of the tourism business, convinced all the other women to stay, and sort of says, well, we're already here. Let's just, we made a deal. Let's just take this trip, do the job, and just sort of accept it as what it is. So that's kind of that level of negotiation. So I think there is an empirical question of how do people in certain contexts sort of interfere in their own kind of discursive making, their own making of their discursive bodies and identities. Then the second level is perhaps more methodological in terms of what I was trying to do, or what I've tried to do in this piece, which is twofold. One is that the stories I recount are all stories that were told to me. They're not things that I observed, right? So it was, and I would argue that it was because these two women know me as, an anthropologist who just kept showing up, who's sort of video recorded their lives for well over a decade now. They tell me these things, and it's partly they tell me because they know that I'll be interested in them. And so there's that, it's this real clear moment of yes, I have interfered in their lives, but we have a relationship. And so when I show up with my camera, they're like, oh, I know something that you'll want to hear. And I'm like, okay, great. Let's go, So I think that's, sort of just a question of how we manage that relationship, right? And then the other level of interference, this will be my last point for now, is just the very form of the article. If you take a look at it online, I had to push the editors of the journal, and they were very receptive to it. I mean, they just wanted to know what my idea was, but I said, it's 3 videos and a text. The videos should come first, no captions, no explanation. They should come first, and then the text, and then let the reader figure out how they're going to read and watch this, right? And so this for me is just my role as someone who works with media and wants to publish, is a way of just kind of, small pushes to the discipline, to our practices of publishing in terms of thinking about how knowledge is presented, what we do with media objects, how we use them alongside text and narrative.
Thanks. So based on these examples, maybe we can return to one assumption that we've been exploring all morning, and this is the contrast between whether you want to interfere with something or not. And so it's very easy to just dismiss, right, and say, of course, you're always interfering. That's fine. But maybe we can go a little bit more slowly in thinking about the affordances or the expectations or assumptions that we make. At what point do you make sense of your work by presuming that interference is the normal, naturalized thing that you would do? And there's other groups of people that think that interference, like your colleague psychologist, is not something that you should aspire for, and in fact, you should actually push against all the time. And so what I'm hoping that we can speak a little bit about is about this contrast, where you see yourselves in this contrast, and what you make in terms of your work about the possibility or desirability of interference or not. So, because there's a way in which we can very quickly just move past the assumption that interference is something that you always are doing whether you want it or not, wittingly or unwittingly, right? And so maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, and if that's okay, maybe we can begin with Jenny.
I think like many people, when I started doing fieldwork as a graduate student, I went with the assumption that I should try to be as neutral and as not invisible, but just less present as possible. And I think in very concrete terms. So one concrete way I did this was that in these villages that I worked at 2 villages. One of them has a very sort of routine daily schedule for when the tourists arrive. The tour buses arrive around 10, come from the inner city. And so I would kind of be up and around in the morning before 10, and then like when the tour groups would come, I'd kind of just disappear. That was when I would do my field notes, and I'd like make a cup of coffee, like Nescafe, and like kind of hide for the lunch hour when it was really busy. Because I didn't want to interfere both in like the work of the villagers who had to host them, but also I didn't like the attention that I would get, because then tourists would start talking to me, et cetera. So I feel like I've kind of gotten over that, but it's definitely, it definitely was a thing that I thought a lot about, just in terms of like the everyday schedule of what I was doing in this place, right? And then, I think the contrast is, I don't know if it's age or just like having sort of been going, because I feel like I am an anthropologist who just kind of keeps going back to the same places. So, 10 years later, like you show up, you can't, like you're a known quantity, and so people, like, it would be odd not to be a part of life in that way. And so there's no way to, I can't hide in the same way that I could, and so the interference has become much more part of kind of really how I think about my work, and like what I'm showing, how I show it, the questions I ask, the topics I'm interested in studying. It's I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to add the way, I really like the way you posed the example of what does not attempting to not interfere get you.
Right.
Both in terms of the object of the research, but also you as a human.
Yeah.
Like, when do you want to protect yourself? Retreat. And that is also a way of thinking about this problem. It's a lot of work to always be very present and always be shaping things.
Yeah, and I feel like as much as, especially as like a graduate student researcher, I was not, that important. I was kind of a novelty in the places. And so I didn't like the attention I would get if I sat in a cafe writing in English, because people would just stop. And it's not because, it's like any feeling of annoyance was on me, right? And so I just sort of quickly stopped doing that because I didn't like it, but it was perfectly fair that someone would come up to me and be like, hey, what are you doing? Right, yeah. So, trying to make myself perhaps, less, and perhaps justifying it by saying, I don't want to interfere. So it became like a justification rather than, or an excuse,
I think similarly in like my field sites in Kazakhstan, when I started going to both of them, my inclination was at least starting out to sort of be quite passive. I think that's part of the reason. And so with the children's home, I didn't record at first. So it felt like the way in which I would be sort of imposing in some way would be by bringing in a camera, although eventually not so different from Jenny's example. These kids actually had people with cameras coming in all the time, and there were security cameras on them, and so I was all worried about like my camera coming in, which was not that big of a deal to them. But for me, it just seemed very, very sort of natural to sit on the floor with them, and then it seemed sort of natural for them to come and play with me. But then when there were questions of I wanted to bring in puppets and to see what they would do with puppets. But I think, you know, with things like that, I sort of waited a while. So I waited before I brought in the camera. I waited before I brought in sort of these other objects that would sort of change what was going on around them, and sort of tried to make myself just this presence who, you know, wasn't not interfering, but I think there was a way in which I think as a graduate student also, and maybe I was in a place in my life where I was super insecure, this sort of enforced passivity, and maybe it's something that sort of comes naturally to me, meant that I avoided asking questions about what was going on, where afterwards I would have these video material where I was like, what's going on? If I had only felt okay asking somebody what was that all about, it would have made all like months of me writing and speculating through it much easier. And so I think now, I don't know how much of it also has to do with the ways in which people see you differently when you're a graduate student versus when you're coming in with some sort of perceived expertise already, or if it's just something with like age and feeling more comfortable in my own skin. Things feel sort of more like there's this back and forth where I feel more like I can ask people, you know, what's going on with that, but it also means that they, you know, invite me to collaborate on filmmaking workshops together rather than me participating in as a wannabe filmmaker, in ways which sometimes I wonder if it would be better if I were still sort of in that position where a non-expert, because sometimes you get so wrapped up in sort of what it is you're doing as like a co-organizer of a filmmaking workshop that I sort of worry about sort of imposing too many of my own ideas rather than it being this back and forth. So I think it can be good to sort of have these checks with yourself of, okay, should I push myself a little bit further and actually ask some questions, or should I step back and stop giving people ideas and let those ideas sort of come out from them. So yeah, it's never easy.
Yeah, this question has me thinking about the morals and values we carry with us wherever we go, whenever we are asked to think about something or do something. And this contrast between, okay, don't interfere versus, well, there's like, you're being beckoned through our like moral positioning to want to interfere. And I feel that tension, but part of what I feel like one has to do is withhold judgment to better understand the situation. So like, for instance, and I have to think through like concrete past examples, like it was a regular thing to see orangutan infants being hit, like juveniles hit, right? It's so like, it looks awful, right? Because it like has these ideas of innocence, like why hit somebody or something. But I needed to understand the situation more and to understand actually there's a logic to this, which is they're trying to make human contact averse. And so they have this odd dynamic where they're in this social relationship trying to make the human side of this relationship an averse experience. But that said, it's like, so yeah, you withhold judgment, but then it's later in the writing process that you can be as judgy as you want, you know? It's in the space of the retrospect, but then that might be morally bankrupt. It might actually be morally bankrupt, you know, like, but at the same time, it gives us moral authority, then actual like empirical authority to say, I knew what happened, this is exactly what happened, and therefore this is what I think should be fixed. This is the kind of interventions and interruptions that or interferences that need to happen. But yeah, it is this odd thing where, okay, you kind of have to withhold your moral judgments to be able to then make an empirical argument, and that it becomes valid and legitimate and convincing once you could say, okay, I know exactly what was happening. And I know what was happening because I kept my my moral standing in check and decided to not interfere in this thing that I needed to observe, to be able to say, okay, now I understand this process because I saw it like X many number of times over this many months, you know? And so, yeah, it is about like withholding the desire to interfere, even as like you are thinking about the situation and thinking about how there would be reason to interfere. So, yeah, and I do think that might make us like morally suspect, like genuinely, you know, that we ethnographers are kind of people who are able to suspend our moral judgments to kind of understand what is the situation going on before I act or intervene. Not everybody can do that, and not many want to do that. But it is something that's being asked of you so that you could say, yeah, I'm like being a fair empiricist here. I understand the situation. But yeah, other fields don't do it that way. Other fields will be more inclined to say, I know what the moral correct answer is, and it's this. But I also think that it's because we have empirical evidence that we can make these fundamentally moralistic arguments about what should happen because we knew what happened.
Yeah. No, these are, thank you to the three of you. I'm thinking this morning we had conversations about engaged anthropology, or people that are doing work in their own communities, or people that have actually been physically even affected or harmed by the processes that they're studying. And I'm sorry, I'm choking myself. And particularly in connection to the times that we're experiencing politically, I think there's a way in which we can rush very quickly to knowing very much in advance how to intervene. And maybe the question could also be not one of whether you should do it or not, but how and based on what. Attending to what ethnography offers you when you understand or approximate the worlds that move you or trouble you or anger you, right? And I think this is something that ethnographers, as you very nicely put it, when you're really committed to pushing the ethnography to the limit in terms of your presence and commitment to the people that you work with, it always puts you in that kind of situation, and in different contexts and institutional circumstances, but you're always gauging your own, like, is this the moment when I should step forward or not?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate the example, and maybe we can collect a couple other examples of, I had a question here about the more experiential and empirical expression of interference. And so the question was there a moment, maybe another moment, when interference felt necessary yet impossible in field work? A moment of looking back when you recognized interference where you saw none at the moment. So you see what the interference was happening, but at the moment you might not have recognized it as such. And this is a question that I'm bringing up from a previous conversation that Jenny, Meghanne, and I had when thinking about the theme for this week. So I think those moments, concrete empirical moments in fieldwork, are really illuminate the scope of things that are at stake in these circumstances.
Yeah. There is this one story I've written about in my book where it was at an orangutan rehabilitation center. They really prized the idea of reproduction. And we're in the situation where it was a lot of like British women volunteers and myself were in the situation where we thought we were about to see a scene of forced copulation. So we started freaking out, like, we didn't want to see that. And it was like really messed up circumstances where it was for the enrichment of this large adult male orangutan that they changed up their cage situation and captive situation And so this very large male orangutan like took a broken piece of concrete and started bashing in the gate. And it looked like he was about to enter this enclosure where there's like 2 super pregnant orangutans there. So we were like freaking out. I was freaking out because I really didn't want to see that. And so then I started like talking out loud, like freaking out. And what was coming out of my mouth was like super liberal language. And I was so embarrassed in retrospect about like consent, where like, oh my God, like, it's like, that's what I come down to, or like, yeah, but like, you know, where like I've written extensively about like, consent doesn't make sense, and like, in a human world, you know, and it's like, this is like weird liberal property ideas being imposed. But yeah, but then everybody, all the other women were also talking like that, because we were like very much over-identifying with the situation, but also super triggered by it. And yeah, it's like, you could see the same scene and other people have a totally different form of interpretation, because the guy who orchestrated it was like, they're gonna take it for the team, and just kind of making jokes when we're like obviously like freaking out. So yeah, like somebody else had, so like we had like audio interferences, you know, but then somebody did the actual intervention, someone who could change the situation. It was one of my like research subjects, Lion, who entered and like closed up stuff, you know, like, so the interference isn't enough. There's like there was interference, there was intervention, and there's a whole slew of different actors all having different kinds of reactions. So yeah, it goes back to this argument that we're not alone in the field, but that like our presence also changes things, but we are also not in a position of power to actually evince the change that we want. Does that make us like a, what is the like the negative word, like not like co-conspirator, but like the worst kind, like a collaborator in a bad sense, you know what I mean? Like
An informant.
informant. Yeah, like does it make us like a accomplice, thank you, an accomplice into business as usual, which is like suspect? Or is it that we acknowledge our limitations? And I'm more inclined to say we acknowledge our limitations, which, you know, I realize is a bit of a cop-out, you know, but at the same time, it's like, it's true, because I want to keep doing the field work to understand the situation better. So that always puts me as a field worker in this weird position of, okay, I want to collect the data because I want to understand the situation, and I want to make sure I have like different perspectives so that I get a better sense of how to understand the situation. But yeah, so then I think it does morally compromise us. And I don't think that's bad, because I think everything is like morally compromised. I don't think there's any like moral purity we can hold on to. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm thinking about moments when interference felt necessary but impossible. I mean, I think there were lots of times having you know worked at a center for toddler development in the US before I went to do my field work. There were ways in which the pedagogical practices I observed were completely different from what I had sort of learned to embrace about validating children's feelings by giving them by giving voice to them versus telling children stop crying, don't cry. To sort of these you know ideas about you know giving children free rein when it comes to free play or art classes versus like these very sort of structured ways in which children were told to how to draw a picture, and I would see a teacher sort of having them do it again and again and again until they got it right, because there was all this pressure on the teachers also to sort of perform their role as a good teacher, because they would have these open lessons where their directors and the other teachers would come in, and so there was something very performative even about the way pedagogy worked there, which you know most of the time I just sort of I tried to focus more on the children's play because that was more interesting to me, but I sort of eventually felt, okay, I need to understand this, because this is part of children's lives, the same way that the performances that they're doing for outsiders all the time is also a part of their lives. I have to sort of understand all aspects of this if I really want to understand them. I can't just focus on, you know, these you know, little bits of time when they're having free play, but a time when I interfered without meaning to. I write about in the last chapter where that once I started bringing in the camera to record their free play. At first, I was just coming in when I knew they had their free play times because that's what I wanted to record. But then one of the teachers said, did I talk about this already on Wednesday? Okay. I think I talked about it yesterday. No, I think I talked about it. Anyway, so this one teacher said, okay, I want to use, like, can you record me giving the kids some lessons? And I was like, oh yeah, this is great because like I'm like, my camera is becoming a tool that's useful for her. And so this is great. And so she staged like these little lessons that were not really lessons. It was sort of her teaching the kids, but they would only last about 30 seconds. And then she was actually like acting like a director. She's like, okay, cut. And then we would go, and she would set up, she would sort of rearrange the tables and we had lots of different lessons. And this was in the afternoon when it was supposed to be the hours when these kids' parents, because this is a temporary institution where they're living, where these kids' parents could come in and visit during these hours. And so I sort of hear off in the background that somebody has arrived and she says, oh, yeah, set it down over there, we're filming right now. And I see that it's one of the kids' dads, it's the only single dad in the group, sort of sets his stuff down, I think maybe like gives his kid a hug and then leaves. As we finish all of this filming, and then she says, okay, and I filmed all of this. Okay, now it's Marlon's birthday. So we're gonna eat this cake and we're gonna sing him happy birthday and give him blessings. But it was like my camera like interfered with him getting to like celebrate his birthday with his dad. And I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't decide for it to happen, but I felt so terrible afterwards. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it was, and it was something where like, I still don't understand what she wanted from those videos, because I thought she was maybe looking for another job, but she stayed there for years afterwards. But I think, but at the same time, it was like information about the sort of crossover between pedagogy and performance, the ways in which they have something in common, and in this institution in particular, the kinds of pressures. But I also think it's true in a lot of educational settings, the ways like the pressures that are put on the educators that then trickle down to the students, that then shape the types of interaction that they feel comfortable or appropriate having with each other.
So did she ask for the videos or?
She did, yeah. She asked for them, but she didn't tell me what she was going to do with them. And I wasn't like, what are you going to do with these?
Yeah.
Are you, yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, but then she would have me record other lessons of hers afterwards. And yeah, it was not clear. But I think part of it was because this sort of institution was a little bit experimental, and that there were sort of the Soviet era permanent orphanages, and then this was a sort of innovation, and I think they always felt like they had to sort of justify their existence, and they did actually shut down right before my book was published. So yeah, I think they always sort of felt like they had to justify themselves, and that they might have to be looking for new work at any time, because there was this discourse that like it was an institution that was supposed to get rid of long-term institutionalization, but it was still an institution, and that it was sort of a temporary fix that needed eventually to lead to children being in private family homes, but without developing a robust welfare scheme for mothers.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can think of lots of moments where I did or did not interfere in the tourism context. And I, you know, part of it is just like by nature of the, you know, tourists like to haggle. So I mean, there were, you know, multiple, like there was a daily occurrence for me to either help someone, help like a villager, like bargain the price, in that case, my job was to help them bargain the price up, right? With a tourist who didn't speak Chinese and it was just like how comfortable or how, how much I wanted to kind of be that person that day and to be like, no, this is a really special piece of embroidery. Like, it's definitely worth 10, like, they're not asking for too much money, and I mean, or on the other hand, helping a tourist, being the other person being and trying to explain like, no, you can bargain, it's okay. They expect you to bargain the price down, like no one's plays asking price, like that's totally normal, and I mean, it's a small thing, but I think it does, it's part of one's, when you're physically present, you are there, and so, it's good to be acknowledged, but with that comes some responsibility to be a part of the interaction. Perhaps more generally, I think a lot about, debates around like activist filmmaking, activist documentary making, and the role in which like a filmmaker or a film project might be trying to deliberately, make an argument, interfere in a certain situation, do policy work, to echo kind of something I said earlier this morning, and how, at least in the anthropological tradition, this is an issue, this is a question up for debate. It's like, how much do you, really, how much should one's filmmaking be a part of an actionable, future or actionable item? And I think a lot about the late filmmaker John Marshall, who was part of the Kalahari expeditions in Southern Africa, and his work and how his work, he started filming very young in his 20s, and it was very, sort of set the bar for like observational filmmaking, that ethnographic observational filmmaking. But then by the end of his career in the 90s was making extremely political films that were basically like, my presence, was part of the decimation of the San, the people, and my films have to do something about that. And so, this real kind of like 180 shift that he had over the course of his career. And yeah, I just.
How do you answer that question?
How do I answer that question? I think, I really do think it has to do with a recognition of some sort of responsibility. And it goes back to, what you're saying about just your undergraduate students, right? It's like they did the research. There is a responsibility to make that research accessible to somebody, right? And so that's why, I really do think a lot about like, what are the objects that we put into the world, right? Is it a book? Is it an article? Is it a film? Is it an interview? These are all things that become part of, other people's evidence and other people's data, and to really accept that as like part of the job, right? So it's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but I've tried to kind of come around to that, to be like, like, Meghanne, your book is in the world and people will read it and do something with it, right? And it's scary. It's really scary to think that that's gonna happen, but otherwise, like, what's the point? So.
No, I really appreciate that, because it's very easy to imagine the big processes that you want to get in the way of. Like, there's like a sort of a general, we're against, some of us, racism. We're against genocide, right? We're against oppression. But when you translate that into the very specifics of your work, I really like this way in which you frame it, where what are the objects that you're putting out there in the world, and how might they become other people's objects? And that changes the way in which you answer that question in a way that I think it's helpful. So thank you for that. And maybe this is a way in which we can get to this ambivalence. And this is maybe the last question that I'll pose, and then I will open it up for comments from people here. So what I numbered with a 5, this idea that interference can also be a violent practice of disrupting that which does not match the interests of others. And it was mentioned the interference with elections or other forms of intervention or interference in history. So I guess the question would be, how do we differentiate between ethical and non-ethical forms of interference, and where can we look to make that determination in our own words. And you all have already talked a little bit about this. If you want to pass, it's okay, but I thought we could explicitly acknowledge this darker side of intervention and interference. And this is something that has been happening all morning. The intervention interference, slippage, and I've caught myself a number of times, so we can also maybe talk about this as well.
Is it my turn to go first? I'll try. I mean, I remember I was thinking about this last night, and something like election interference I was thinking about is like, it's an example of where for one thing, the interference is hidden and unknown. So people think that they're doing something, that they're freely entering into a process that is in some ways fair to them, and they're being manipulated without realizing, and in that way it's sort of thwarting the democratic process, which is what they think that they're participating in. And so I think, it was because you had mentioned like how Meghanne, you'll be there as the linguistic anthropologist. And when I was at the airport, all of a sudden the term linguistic interference popped into my head. I was like, that's a thing, I've got to look it up. And so I was reading about it. And it also gets called linguistic transfer. This might move away too much from what you were asking, but anyway, this idea, what gets called linguistic interference and also gets called linguistic transfer, is the way that L1, your first language, can interfere in different ways with the language that you're learning, but it can go both ways. So if it's a language that's similar, it'll sort of help you along, whereas if it's something that's different, then it's sort of standing in your way. And it was working through the like different examples of how that works, but the way that where it's sort of accelerating things, we often we're less likely to even think about or comment about, because it's just sort of taken for granted that that's helping us. And so I guess like those examples can be thinking about, okay, so I think a lot of what we've been trying to do today is sort of make ourselves somewhat more aware of when is it that we're interfering, how are we interfering, even if that doesn't end up being the bulk of what we're writing about, because we want to write about these other things, but sort of being more explicit about those, at least for ourselves, is sort of different from sort of trying to actively change the results of what's going to happen through sort of covert means. Stop there.
Yeah, like, I'm trying to think of an example of, because like, I feel like on when it's considered good or positive interference, the language in ethnography or anthropology we use is participation, right? It's participatory, it's collaborative, it's all these things. So I say this with the tinge of like, what are we actually saying when we say this, right? But that is, that's good interference, right? That's considered, and it can bring very positive and empowering results. I don't want to deny that. The bad side of it, like the flip side of that, of like ethnographic interference would be like, is it Napoleon Chagnon? And like, is it that level of maybe, right? Is it and who are you interfering with? I recently, in one of my undergraduate classes, I had them read just a chapter of Paul Rabinow's Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco. The chapter, I can't remember the title of it, but it's the one where he talks about how he basically had one of his friends in the village sort of plant the seed of discontent so that other people would start talking to Rabinow about this sort of history, this very contentious political history in the village that he wanted to talk about. Mm-hmm. And his friend was like, yeah, I'll do it. And Rabinow in the chapter is like, so we did. I got the information I wanted, and it's like, and in his right in that very Rabinow way is sort of like, yeah, it probably wasn't like super ethical. I got what I wanted, and like no one got physically hurt, and so it's like, yeah, it's like the question is like, is it results that we need? And sometimes it is. Otherwise, you spend 6 months wondering what you just filmed and wishing you would just ask the question, right? Yeah, so that's the first thing that popped in my head about.
Yeah, the word interference to me does have like a negative connotation precisely for these ideas of corruption behind it. Like I think about election interference as you had posed in the written form of the question. And yeah, and I keep thinking about, well, that question of interference is a question of justice. What is your definition of justice? What's your definition of oppression? Is your definition of oppression contingent on disenfranchising people? Then it's probably not just, is it? You know, but then it's weird that these very moral questions, moral and philosophical questions are up for debate in this particular moment. And it's really disturbing because like, oh, that might mean we don't share a reality. You know, and so then what's the use of any empirical work if you don't even believe what I just said? You know what I mean? If we can't even trust the same source, or if our interpretations are so wildly different from each other. And if that's the case, then we're in a much deeper crisis. So yeah, I'm giggling, but yeah, no, I think that's the existential crisis we're in now. And like, yeah, I continue to value ideas of the truth, ideas of evidence. And so, yeah, I'm gonna fight tooth and nail and to my death for the ability to say, this is what I saw, this is the forms of evidence, and evidence comes to matter in what our positions are. That we can't just like talk nonsense, because sense matters a lot to me. And so, yeah, and hopefully we can be in a society where others share that sentiment, that sense is important and matters.
No,
It doesn't even have to be the same exact sense,
right.
but just the acknowledgement that there can be interpretations of sense and senses, but that we at least share a reality. And yeah, that I think is the burning question of our era right now.
Thank you. So with that, we now have time for comments or questions, or those of you that were here in the morning, feel free to bring things from that conversation if you feel like it. So floor is yours, and we'll have like a few seconds of the awkward silence until somebody feels that they want to put something on the table or comment. Yes, thank you. Maybe you can say your name.
Yeah,
So we have a couple of people.
My name's Russell, anthropology student at UCSB. And from our morning conversation, I research kind of extractivism and things like that. And thinking of interference and these discussions which we talked about, I'm kind of curious, and particularly thinking of like visual ethnography, of how these things can like change based off changing political like situations, and how something that like could be safe now can be something that can incriminate someone like 5 years down the line, when just like moral values are entirely flipped to where like DEI is now something that can get used like deported to a degree, or like, you know, is vilified, and working on something that is DEI and showing it like feeling super safe. So like things like that, when you're thinking about that with our current political, like this, the time scale of like how like our actions can impact people to like a historical almost level, and especially since we're writing, or like, you know, creating archives.
Yeah. Okay, you know, I think that, yeah, this is a very timely question that you're asking, a very important one. And I think the important thing to remember is that the United States is not, that the United States isn't the only place where we produce knowledge. And that this is really very urgently showing us that it certainly is not the only place we could produce knowledge. And so remembering that the United States isn't the only game in town, and that there are other places that support intellectual endeavors. So that like researching Palestine, researching like incarceration, researching racial disparities, health disparities, like social inequalities and how they have material effects, those matter in other places. And it's just right now in this political moment, and like we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And I think like thinking beyond the United States is extremely helpful. Like Brazil is the example people are using a lot, like Angela Davis talks about this, and many Brazilian academics who suffered through the Bolsonaro regime know this, that they're like trans scholars, feminist scholars, like indigenous scholars who were there in the midst of a very heated anti-intellectual moment and who found new ways to continue doing what they're doing and who are like driven by like a moral purpose to the work that they do. So if like in this like state of crisis and emergency, if we could somehow take a step back and remember this is just a moment that's making us not think. And if we remember our value is to keep thinking, then hopefully we can persevere and hopefully remember, maybe I should apply for an ERC, you know, maybe I should apply, go find other funding sources, maybe I need to move to Canada, you know? So yeah, if you could like keep that in mind, or like academia in Mexico, you know what I mean? Like other places are not in this weird toxic moment. You know, and this may be an example of American exceptionalism. But if you could like hold on to like both your moral compass, while also obviously like protecting your informants as best as you can, but also like yourself of like feeling like, okay, what is really important to me, you know? And then, yeah, just like if you could like continue to be driven by your own moral purpose, I think then you may be in a position willing to like erase all your social media when you cross a border into the United States, and do other forms of protection to make it necessary for you to do the work, like under these authoritarian contexts. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that it's good to, as we know, it's not a new or unique situation that images of people are at once powerful and dangerous, right? And I think that part of what we have to keep doing as anthropologists also is sort of continually train ourselves on what are the implications and how does that change sort of what informed consent means, because working in the context of European migration routes and things like that, there are ways in which the migrants themselves might not understand the implications as they're posting things on social media and then getting to Germany and being told, okay, we have proof that you entered the EU in Croatia and we're sending you back. And so sort of, and the ways in which there are sort of traces on your phone and like the sort of metadata, the ways in which people we're working with might not be totally aware of those things. And yet we sort of have to educate ourselves about things that might not even be the objects of our research, but are still sort of an important part of what it means to do research and to understand informed consent, but also thinking about, with all of those things in mind, thinking again about this sort of the temporality and what's at stake. So an example I was thinking of is a colleague in Croatia who's done quite a bit of work in camps like between the Bosnia-Croatia border with guys who were trying to get into Croatia and have been pushed back 20, 30 times, and the camp had been it was supposed to be dismantled and then there was a fire. Anyway, so they were on a hunger strike to protest the conditions that they were living in, and the foreign media were being denied access. And so they called him and had their phone on video but facing out, and because they wanted him to be this outlet to get them attention. He's like, are you sure that it's okay for me to share this? And for them, yeah, maybe that would, there's a risk that they're willing to undertake, that this might affect them months down the line when they're in Germany or whatever. But for now, it's like, they don't have access to food. Like, look at what we're living in. Like, we need you to show people this now, because this is too important not to show. And he had to sort of respect that and say, okay, this is what they wanted. And they're the ones who were sort of in control of what's being shown, that I think was still uncomfortable for him, and yet, still felt like he needed to exactly what they were asking him to do.
Just add, visual material is tricky. The way that, sort of dominant discourse thinks about images is very different than the way that text is approached. Text doesn't, language creates barriers that images don't purport to have the same barriers. And so I just think, working with images, whether still or moving, it's something that does have to be kind of considered separate from the textual production, that one might create. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, whatever is published now, 5-10 years down the line, can still be seen. It's like, and in all honesty, it's like your image, more people will probably look at an image or a short film that you make than read your wonderfully, deep 15-page article. So yeah, and I mean, I just sort of thinking about these things in the moment of production, I think can be helpful. It shouldn't be debilitating. I mean, that's the trick, right? It's like, I don't want it to be like, so therefore you gotta, scrub all faces. But sometimes that's what you do, right? I mean, you pixelate faces. Sometimes you don't. If people say that they don't want their faces to be, scrubbed out, then you leave them because that's their choice. But it's also about making it clear, you are recognizable. You are an individual in a way that you are not in words, I think.
Yeah, there's a question of why we always want the face.
Yeah.
Right, and what kinds of images you can produce that are as inviting as
Yeah.
that don't necessarily have they will always have something, but yeah, that's a great question. We have other questions. Did you have a question? Oh, how about we take both and then people can respond. So Peter and then Xiaoyu and then.
Sure. Well, thank you for this very thought-provoking discussion at this moment. I wasn't present in the morning, so I apologize if this is ground you've already covered. But I was thinking about your comments. I'm thinking also about what we mean by interference relative to time, because that's coming out over and over again. That's something you do at a given moment. You don't know what it might do later once it's out in the world and on its own, what afterlife it might have. And you might do something for one reason and then other people use it for other reasons. And that there is always this fiction of control, I think, that we like to project into the world, that we can actually determine the fate, especially those things that we say or we do, or any ways in which we act, which of course we know is an utter a fiction. And so I was wondering in terms of where you see this question of, and I was thinking of different examples as well, that you have moments where you don't want to interfere too quickly before you understand, for example, a perfectly reasonable stance that small children are taught to do regularly, that think before you touch, or think before you act, or think before you say something. These are all long-standing human forms of wisdom that get passed down intergenerationally in a sense. And then the way in which you might reappraise your career late in life, like Marshall, that's something you did early on had effects that you didn't anticipate at the moment when you were doing it, and then you feel like you have to remediate the situation. So I was wondering, in terms of time, what kind of time horizon do we imagine with interference? Since life is interference all the time in a sense, but when we use that word to describe something that's going on, what kind of time boundary is placed around it?
Thank you. Let's take Xiaoyu and.
Thank you, Peter. I think I'm just asking a question from a different perspective of time. That is, we've talked a lot about interference in the field, or before we really analyzing the data we collected. But what about post field work interference, or post post-book, like post-monograph interference. Today a lot of anthropologists are starting like sending back their like journal articles or book chapters back to their interlocutors to maybe ask for suggestions or ask for their comments. Might be creating more possibilities of like interference that is post-analysis. That means like anthropological knowledge is already being produced somehow, then how could interference actually happen? Yeah.
I have just a couple random thoughts. I haven't quite strung them together yet in my head, but on the question of time and temporality, one of the things I was thinking of as I walked over here was I feel like all my research is interference now because I don't have the time to do long-term fieldwork anymore, right? So I plan these, 4 days, a week, like drop in, go, find your people, call them, say, you got time for coffee tomorrow? Like, that's it. And I'm in and I'm out. And I'm lucky if I get that, And so it's a completely different way of thinking about like how to interfere, what the temporality of research and sort of my role in it. But yeah, I mean, I think Peter, in terms of like thinking about the like longue durée of research and like a research life, right? I guess what's helpful for me is sort of just coming to terms with the expectation that something unexpected is going to happen to me, because I feel like, in anthropology, much of what we sort of study are the unexpected consequences of X, the Chinese state has policy on stability. What are the unexpected consequences of that policy, right? And we're, I feel like I have the tools to answer that question, but then what are the unexpected consequences, of my work or of, an image that I make going out about? And Andrea, I totally agree with you that the focus on the face is really interesting because more and more of the stuff that I produce for publication or for public consumption, I try not to have people's faces in. And I often get asked, like, could you have something that's like shows us, who they are? And I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do that this time, And then Chio, I think your question is really astute. I don't really have an answer for you, but yeah, I mean, what happens like interference isn't just about being in the field, it's also afterwards, right? And the question of like sharing research findings or what good that does, right? Like, is it so I feel better about myself? I mean, I'm very cynical about these things and I shouldn't be quite so negative, but like, or is there a way, is there a project to be done and sort of sitting with one's work and thinking about like, what good could this do? And how can I make it into something that is usable for the community, right? And so reformulating like the actual question that one is asking, not just like, should I give it back? But like, why and in what form is it useful?
I have such a banal response to your question, Peter, which is for me, the question of when to interfere is like, oh, it's a matter of years or months, and it's because like I'm in my mid-40s, reflecting on the writing, and then I feel like, okay, now I can interfere and intervene with more knowledge in hand. And I think about scholars, the person I think about is like Michael Pellet's, so random, but anyways, like Michael Pellet's work of coming back to a field site that he had written, I think, his dissertation on, so that might have been like 40 years, and that's like then a question of decades. And so part of it is like catching up to understand, okay, what is going on with the situation, and then to be able to offer analysis. But I don't know why I think about it in such a banal way, and I think it's because I'm thinking in the scope of a human lifetime, that the answer for me is like months and years, And so, and I guess the point is that by sticking with a human life duration, then it's acknowledging the point that to avoid the feeling of being too late, right? Of like, you carry this knowledge, much of it never even made it to the book. And what do you do with that if it's like weighing on your moral conscience, you know? And so then to do it before you die is the ideal. Yeah. And I just, not just you, but I say collective. I think are you, like us, you know? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm such a gothic person, I always think about death, and so like, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think, okay, so in terms of this first question about how we do something for one reason and people might use it for others and the sort of unanticipated effects of our research, like with my first field site, I mean, I sort of feel, and I think that this is a shortcoming of it. I sort of don't think that it matters at all. I think like when with the sort of puppet community, I was invited to give talks a couple of times about my research in the context of these puppet festivals. They would have a sort of academic conference, and for the first one, they actually were like, "You're American, so you'll talk about American puppetry." So I did have this research about American puppetry, and I presented that. And then in another one, I sort of presented some of my like theories of animation. And the puppeteers that I was working with and the directors were all invited to that, and they were all utterly uninterested in it, which was fine. I mean, but I think it was sort of, and maybe that was sort of a relief, because it would have been a lot of pressure all of a sudden if they had seen me as sort of an expert about something. And then when I was publishing one thing, I think I needed permission for an image, and so they were like, "Oh, can we read the text and approve it before?" And I got sort of nervous because it was about this like moment of conflict at the puppet theater, and I knew that director had left already, and he was fine with me talking about this and using his name. But the puppet theater, so they read it, but it was a linguistic anthropology piece. They were like, "It's fine, we didn't understand anything." So I think that when I've only gone back like a couple of times since I finished my field work, and it was more about the relationships that I had with certain people, and I saw that those mattered to them the same way that those mattered to me, even though I don't do field work there anymore, and it's something I sort of regret. So I think there's a way in which then I sort of have let some of my regrets about the sort of difficulty of maintaining these ongoing relationships, I sort of carry that into the field work that I'm doing now, where it's sort of like I found conditions where it's easier to sort of maintain this relationship, where I can go back and forth and I can try different things out with people and I can talk with them. And I can send them the things that I'm writing and get their feedback. And related to this question about sort of getting feedback on work, I don't know if you know Steve Feld's article on dialogic editing, but he describes this process of sort of similar to that scene in Chronicle of a Summer where they're showing a film and getting feedback about that. But the way that can create a conversation, it can create new information. So it doesn't have to be about sort of research results and what happens to the results, but there's this kind of constant conversation is happening, so that it's not sort of one thing that we're sort of throwing out into the world and seeing it have these scary reverberations, but always kind of revising as part of like what our career is. That can also maybe make things a little bit, I think the fact that we can also, as Marshall did, like publish things where we say, "Oh, I made a mistake. I'm gonna try to do something different," can also make it less paralyzing maybe to write the wrong thing or to say the wrong thing to begin with. This idea that you can change your mind, revise your thoughts.
And I just want to add that we can think about it at the scale of a career, but as students, you can also think about this at the scale of the duration of your fieldwork, right? And that, like, it's almost like a fractal unit. So it doesn't have to be decades, it can be weeks, right? When you do exercise this back and forth. So you don't have to wait until you're at the end of your
That's
dying.
That's true.
Right? Okay, well, I think we're at time. You have one question?
Well, an online question, since we're over, maybe I'll just share it for
Yeah.
us to think about. This is from Dima Shahin, and she asks, how could interference be an act of compassion to oneself or to the participants?
That's a lovely question. Should we just react quickly, just briefly?
I mean, I'll just go quickly. Joel's not here, is he? Who is in the workshop this morning, but Joel, his work on the waiting room, the waiting in hospitals with patients who are waiting for a heart transplant. You know, it just got me thinking, like, I just tried to imagine him in the hospital with a patient. And I was like, just his mere presence is an interference, but it's a comforting one, you know, hopefully it does, at least I'm. This is my skepticism coming out again, because I don't know, I wasn't there, but, you know, I read it as a comforting one, you know, and that is a form of interference, that is a form of care, right? To spend that time, you know, and to really sort of just be there, and I mean, I think, yeah, so I wanna just, I wanted to say that to him, but he's not here, so I'll just put it in the universe for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think related to that, I mean, for me, my fieldwork, being in the field for different reasons was a hard thing, but actually like being in my field sites, especially being with the children, like was like the best part of my day. So I think that if I had listened to that person who said like, you're not allowed to play with the children, you can only put the camera in and walk away, which was what she said I should have done, like how much like I personally would have lost from getting to have that time with them, which I was super grateful for.
The times I think of when I interfered with something in the midst of fieldwork, it was because it was messing with my moral integrity. And I felt like I had to stop something or say something. And so, yeah, like I do think like the impetus was out of care. It might have been out of naivete, but hopefully like it's, one could just hope that your moral compass is in line with the others surrounding you to kind of remind you, yeah, that was something that required speaking up and for that moment being brave to interrupt. Yeah.
Okay, well, join me in thanking our.